I died a villain, manipulative, selfish, and utterly despised by the man I'd forced into marriage. A fitting end, perhaps, for a woman who'd built her life on lies. But apparently, the universe wasn't done with me yet. I woke up on my wedding day, years in the past, with the memories of my disastrous marriage to Duke Alexander Hawthorne fresh in my mind. He was cold, distant, a man hardened by my betrayal. I deserved his hatred, but this time, I was determined to earn his forgiveness, even if it meant setting him free. This time, Eleanor Whitmore wouldn't be the villain of the story. This time, I'd be the heroine, even if it killed me. Again, silk sheets. Great. Just what every newly dead and reborn woman needs. A reminder of the ridiculously opulent life she didn't deserve. I, Eleanor Whitmore, woke up not in the afterlife, but in the ridiculously plush bed I'd last occupied 10 years and one lifetime ago. Today was my wedding day. Again, joy. Except this time, the thought of marrying Duke Alexander Hawthorne, the human glacier, filled me with the kind of dread usually reserved for tax audits and root canals. In my previous attempt at this whole marriage thing, I'd been a gold-digging, social-climbing, manipulative. Well, let's just say I wasn't winning any Wife of the Year awards. I'd wanted his title, his money, his power. I'd gotten a loveless marriage, a public shaming, and a lonely demise courtesy of my darling personality. I looked around the room at the obscene display of wealth, the gown that probably cost more than a small country, the flowers that were destined to wilt before I did again. It was all so pointless, so utterly, ridiculously wrong. And there he was, Alexander, standing by the window, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Probably calculating the cost-benefit analysis of defenestration versus marrying me. Can't say I blamed him. Past me had been a prize bitch. This time, I muttered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, I will follow my heart. My heart, which at the moment was screaming, run, flee, fake your own death and become a goat herder. Sadly, that wasn't an option. The wedding itself was an exercise in enduring torture. Imagine the most ostentatious, over-the-top ceremony you can, then multiply it by 10. I was pretty sure the flower arrangements alone could have funded a small revolution. I, of course, was expected to be radiant, thrilled, the picture of a blushing bride. Instead, I felt like a condemned prisoner walking the last mile. Except I wasn't blushing. I was pale, subdued, and probably sweating enough to ruin the ridiculously expensive makeup they'd slathered on me. Old me would have been basking in the attention, reveling in the envy of every other woman in the room. New me just wanted to find a strong drink in a quiet corner. Alexander, bless his icy heart, looked like he was attending a funeral, not a wedding. His jaw was clenched, his eyes were fixed on some distant point in space, and his smile. Well, let's just say it didn't reach his eyes. He probably would have preferred the funeral. Are you all right, Eleanor? He asked, his voice about as warm as a Siberian winter. Peachy, Your Grace, I replied, managing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. Just overwhelmed by the festivities. He gave me a look that clearly said, I'm not buying it, but I also don't care enough to investigate. Fair enough. And then there was Lady Margaret, his mother, the Dowager Dragon, I'd mentally dubbed her. She was looking at me like I was a particularly unpleasant insect she'd found in her priceless antique teacup. You seem different, Lady Hawthorne, she said, her voice sharp enough to shatter glass. Marriage is a transformative experience, Your Grace, I said, channeling my inner obedient wife. One strives to improve. She snorted, clearly unconvinced. I'd give her a week before she started suggesting rest cures and fresh air. Eagle's Crest, the Hawthorne ancestral home, was basically a museum masquerading as a house. It was grand, imposing, and about as welcoming as a tax audit. It perfectly reflected Alexander's personality, actually. Cold, distant, and probably hiding a lot of secrets in the basement. Our relationship was non-existent. We were strangers playing house, two actors stuck in a play we hadn't auditioned for. We had separate wings of the mansion, thank God. And our interactions were limited to awkward silences at mealtimes and the occasional stilted conversation in the hallway. I, however, was determined to be different. not the grasping, social climbing harpy he remembered. I was polite, respectful, and almost aggressively unobtrusive. I practically tiptoed around him, avoiding eye contact and generally trying to make myself as invisible as possible. My plan, as it were, was to be so utterly unremarkable, so completely not the woman he'd married before that he'd be practically begging for an annulment. Freedom, I figured, was preferable to a lifetime of icy glares and simmering resentment. Of course, I also needed to subtly undo the damage I'd done, secure the Hawthorne family's future, without their knowledge, obviously, and generally avoid dying a pitiful death. Again, easy peasy. All I needed was a plan, a miracle, and possibly a very large bottle of wine. The game, as they say, was on. And this time, I was playing for keeps. My sanity, for one. And maybe, just maybe, a shot at a life that didn't suck. Finding Alexander alone was a challenge in itself. The man was practically a shadow, flitting between meetings, estate business, and the endless social obligations that came with being a duke. He was also, understandably, avoiding me like the plague. I finally cornered him in the library, a vast, imposing room filled with more books than I'd probably read in both my lifetimes combined. He was standing by the window, staring out at the sprawling estate, his expression unreadable, as always. "Your Grace," I said, my voice surprisingly steady considering the tremor in my hands. "May I have a word?" He turned, his gray eyes cool and distant. "Lady Hawthorne," he replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it, the moment of truth. "I need to apologize," I began, the words feeling awkward and inadequate, "for everything, for my behavior in the past, for the circumstances of our marriage." He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Apologize? After all this time? After everything you've done?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "I was selfish, manipulative, cruel. I used you, Alexander. I used your name, your position, your everything. And I'm truly sorry." The words, once spoken, felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't a complete confession, of course. I couldn't tell him about the rebirth, about the future, about the fire. That would be madness, but it was a start, an honest acknowledgement of my past sins. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I could practically feel his suspicion, his distrust, radiating off him in waves. "And what prompted this sudden change of heart, Lady Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Did you finally realize the error of your ways? Or is this another scheme?" "It's not a scheme, Alexander," I said, my voice pleading. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try, to make amends, to make things right." He continued to stare at me, his gaze piercing, searching for any hint of deception. "I ruined your life, Alexander," I confessed, the words spilling out of me in a rush. "I tarnished your reputation. I forced you into a marriage you didn't want. I made you miserable. I won't do it again. Give me 1 year, Alexander. 1 year to make things better, to improve the estate, to help in any way I can, and then I'll disappear. I'll grant you an annulment. You'll be free." It was a bold offer, a risky gamble. I was essentially offering him everything he'd ever wanted. Freedom from our sham marriage, control of his own life. But I was also asking for something in return. A chance. A chance to prove that I was different, that I was capable of change, that I deserved a second chance. He was silent for a long time, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he spoke. 1 year, Lady Hawthorne," he said, his voice cold and measured. 1 year to prove your sincerity. But be warned, I will be watching you closely. And if you slip up, if you show even the slightest hint of your former self, I will not hesitate to end this charade permanently." "I understand, Your Grace," I replied, my voice firm, "and I accept your terms." It wasn't a victory, not exactly. It was a truce, a temporary reprieve, a chance to prove myself, to earn his trust, to to perhaps one day earn his forgiveness. But it was also a challenge I was determined to meet. I had 1 year to change his mind, to change his heart, to change our fate. The game, as always, was fraught with peril. But this time, I was playing for something real, something worth fighting for, something more than just survival. I was playing for redemption. And perhaps if I was very, very lucky, for love. The odds were stacked against me, the past a heavy burden. But I, Eleanor Whitmore, reborn and regretful, was ready to play. And this time, I wouldn't settle for anything less than a complete and utter victory. Over my past, over my enemies, and perhaps even over the Ice Duke's frozen heart. The Hawthorne family, for all its power and prestige, was not immune to the frailties of human existence. Lady Margaret Hawthorne, the Dowager Duchess, the matriarch, the iron fist in a velvet glove, was ill. It started subtly, a persistent cough, a lingering fatigue, a general malaise that the family physician dismissed as a touch of the ague. But I knew better. I remembered with a chilling clarity the events of my past life. Lady Margaret's illness, left untreated, would escalate, weakening her immune system, making her vulnerable to a secondary infection that would ultimately— No, I wouldn't let that happen. This was my chance, my opportunity to make amends, to prove that I was different, to save a life. I believe I can help, I said during a tense family meeting where the physician was delivering his increasingly pessimistic prognosis. All eyes turned to me, surprise and skepticism etched on every face. Alexander, seated beside me, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Help, Lady Hawthorne? The physician, a pompous, self-important man named Dr. Lewis, scoffed. And how, pray tell, would you do that? With your social graces? With my knowledge, doctor, I replied, my voice calm and steady. I've studied herbal remedies. I believe I know of a treatment that could alleviate Her Grace's symptoms. Lady Margaret, propped up on pillows in her enormous bed, looked at me with narrowed eyes. Herbal remedies? She said, her voice weak but still laced with her usual authority. You mean witchcraft? It's not witchcraft, Your Grace, I said patiently. It's ancient knowledge, natural medicine. There's a specific combination of herbs that, when properly prepared, can be very effective in treating certain ailments. Dr. Lewis snorted. Poppycock, he declared. These old wives' tales are dangerous. I will not allow you to interfere with my patient, Lady Hawthorne. It's my life, doctor, Lady Margaret said, her voice surprisingly firm. And I will decide what treatments I receive. If Lady Hawthorne believes she can help, I will at least hear her out. It was a small victory, a crack in the wall of resistance. I presented my proposed remedy, a carefully concocted mixture of herbs based on a recipe I remembered from— Well, it didn't matter where I remembered it from. The important thing was, it worked. But there was a problem, a significant problem. The key ingredient, I explained, is ginseng, a rare, wild variety that grows only in the Shadow Mountains. The Shadow Mountains. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. They were a dangerous, unforgiving place, filled with wild beasts, treacherous terrain, and rumors of darker things. Impossible, Dr. Lewis declared. No one ventures into the Shadow Mountains. It's suicide. It's necessary, I said, my voice unwavering. If we want to save Her Grace's life, we have no choice. Alexander, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. I will go, he said, his voice firm. I will lead an expedition to retrieve the ginseng. I shook my head. No, Your Grace, I said. It's too dangerous. And besides, you're needed here. I'll go. The reaction was predictable. Shock, disbelief, outrage. You, Lady Margaret said, her voice incredulous. A woman? Alone? Into the Shadow Mountains? Absolutely not. I'm not afraid, Your Grace, I said, meeting her gaze directly. And I know what I'm doing. I know where to find the ginseng. I know how to survive. It was a lie, of course. I'd never been to the Shadow Mountains, but I had my memories, my knowledge, my determination. And I had Riven, my small earth spirit companion. After a tense, protracted argument, I finally convinced them, or rather, I wore them down. I was stubborn, persistent, and frankly, they were desperate. The journey to the Shadow Mountains was as perilous as I'd anticipated. The terrain was rugged, the weather unpredictable, and the wildlife unfriendly. I faced treacherous cliffs, raging rivers, and the constant threat of wild beasts, but I persevered. I used my limited knowledge of survival skills, my growing connection to the earth, and Riven's invaluable guidance to navigate the dangers. He was small, but mighty and always loyal. After days of arduous travel, I finally found it. The ginseng, a patch of rare wild plants growing in a secluded valley hidden deep within the mountains. I harvested the root carefully, reverently, thanking the earth for its bounty. And then I turned and began the long, dangerous journey back to Hawthorne Manor. I returned, exhausted, bruised, and battered, but triumphant. I had the ginseng. I had the key to Lady Margaret's recovery. I prepared the remedy myself, following the recipe I remembered with painstaking accuracy. I infused the herbs with my own energy, channeling my will, my determination, my hope into the mixture. And then I personally administered the remedy to Lady Margaret, staying by her bedside, monitoring her condition, willing her to recover. And she did. Slowly, gradually, her strength returned. Her cough subsided, her fever broke, and the color returned to her cheeks. She started to eat, to talk, to live again. It was a miracle, or at least that's what everyone called it. But I knew it was something else. It was the power of knowledge, of determination, of a second chance. Lady Margaret, the formidable Dowager Duchess, looked at me with new eyes. The skepticism, the suspicion was still there, but it was tempered by something else: respect, gratitude, perhaps even a flicker of affection. "You saved my life, Lady Hawthorne," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I will not forget it." It was a turning point, a shift in the balance of power. I had proven myself, not as a social climber, not as a manipulator, but as a healer, a protector, a force for good. The family dynamic changed, subtly but significantly. Alexander, while still reserved, treated me with a newfound respect, a growing admiration. The servants, who had once whispered about me behind my back, now looked at me with awe. I had gained a foothold within the Hawthorne household. I had earned a measure of trust, of respect, of power, and I intended to use it. Not for personal gain, not for social climbing, but for redemption. For a chance to build a better future, for myself, for Alexander, and for everyone whose lives I could touch. The game, as always, was ongoing. But this time I was playing with a purpose, and that purpose, I knew, was more than just survival. It was about healing. Both myself and this broken world I'd been thrust into, Whitmore Manor. The name itself tasted of dust and neglect. It was a smaller estate, part of the vast Hawthorne holdings, but largely forgotten. A relic of a bygone era. In my past life, it had been my playground, a stage for my extravagant parties, a symbol of my wastefulness. I'd demanded renovations, imported exotic furnishings, and generally treated the place like my personal piggy bank, draining its resources without a second thought. This time, I saw it with different eyes. I saw potential. It stood on a gentle rise overlooking a small, sleepy village, its once grand facade crumbling, its gardens overgrown, its interiors filled with the ghosts of forgotten generations. It was a challenge, a project, a blank slate. "It's charming," I said to Alexander as we stood on the overgrown terrace, surveying the neglected estate. It was the first time we'd ventured out together, a tentative step towards something. Friendship? Alliance? I wasn't sure yet. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Charming? It's a ruin, Eleanor. It would cost a fortune to restore it to its former glory." "Perhaps," I said, my mind already racing with possibilities. "But perhaps it doesn't need to be restored to its former glory. Perhaps it needs to be reimagined." He looked at me, his eyes narrowed, intrigued despite himself. "And what, pray tell, do you have in mind, Lady Hawthorne?" "I have an idea," I said, my voice filled with a newfound enthusiasm. "An idea that could benefit the estate, the community, and us." My proposal, when I presented it to Alexander and his ever-skeptical mother, was met with disbelief. "A bookstore?" Lady Margaret said, her voice laced with disdain. You want to turn Whitmore Manor into a shop for books? It's more than just a shop, Your Grace, I explained patiently. It's a cultural center, a place for people to gather, to learn, to connect. There's no bookstore for miles around. The villagers, the estate workers, even the gentry, they crave knowledge, entertainment, a sense of community. Alexander, to his credit, seemed intrigued. A bookstore? He said thoughtfully. It's unconventional. It's brilliant, I corrected him. It's a low-risk, high-reward venture. It requires minimal investment, utilizes existing resources, and caters to a untapped market. Lady Margaret remained unconvinced. It's undignified, Eleanor, she said. A noblewoman running a shop? It's simply not done. Perhaps it's time we changed what's done, Your Grace, I replied, my voice firm. And that's when Lady Beatrice, Alexander's aunt, entered the picture. She was a formidable woman, sharp-tongued and shrewd, with a keen eye for business and a healthy dose of skepticism. She'd been listening to the exchange with a growing amusement. A bookstore, you say, she said, her eyes twinkling. And you think you can make a profit from such a foolish venture? I do, Lady Beatrice, I replied, meeting her gaze directly. I'll tell you what, Lady Hawthorne, she said, a sly smile playing on her lips. I'll make you a bet. If you can turn Whitmore Manor into a profitable bookstore within 1 month, I will personally endorse your endeavor. I will even invest in it. And if I fail? I asked, my heart pounding. Then, she said, her smile widening, you will abandon this ridiculous scheme and return to your proper duties as the Duchess of Hawthorne, which, I remind you, do not include running a shop. It was a challenge, a gamble, a test, and I couldn't resist. I accept your bet, Lady Beatrice, I said, my voice firm. 1 month, and I assure you, I will succeed. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into the project, pouring all my energy, my knowledge, my past life frustrations into transforming Whitmore Manor. I hired local workers, paying them fair wages, treating them with respect, earning their loyalty and their hard work. We cleared out the debris, repaired the damaged structures, and transformed the neglected manor into a warm, inviting, and utterly unique bookstore. I used my limited but growing funds to acquire a collection of books, classics, contemporary works, educational texts, even a few carefully selected and discreetly obtained magical tomes. I knew what people wanted, what they craved, what they needed, but it wasn't just about the books. It was about the experience. I remembered the bookstores of my past life, the cozy cafes, the author readings, the sense of community. I wanted to recreate that, to bring a touch of modernity, of innovation to this tradition-bound world. We need to offer refreshments, I told my small but enthusiastic staff. Coffee, tea, pastries. Make it a place where people want to linger, to browse, to connect. But Lady Hawthorne, one of the workers said hesitantly, no one around here has ever heard of a bookstore that serves coffee. Then we'll be the first, I replied, smiling. We'll be trendsetters. I organized reading events, inviting local scholars and storytellers to share their knowledge and their tales. I created a children's corner filled with colorful books and comfortable cushions. I even daringly introduced a lending library system, allowing people to borrow books for a small fee. It was a gamble, a risk, but it paid off. Whitmore Books, as I'd christened it, became a sensation. People flocked from miles around, drawn by the unique atmosphere, the wide selection of books, and the sense of community that I'd so carefully cultivated. The villagers loved it, the estate workers embraced it, even the gentry, initially skeptical, found themselves charmed by the novelty, the warmth, the sheer audacity of it all. I, of course, played the part of the humble proprietor, greeting customers, offering recommendations, and generally making myself indispensable. I was no longer the aloof, entitled noblewoman. I was a businesswoman, an entrepreneur, a force to be reckoned with. And the profits were undeniable. Lady Beatrice, true to her word, conceded defeat. She even, grudgingly, admitted that she'd underestimated me. You've surprised me, Lady Hawthorne, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of annoyance and respect. You've actually made this ridiculous scheme work. It's not ridiculous, Lady Beatrice, I replied, smiling. It's innovative. It's the future. And as I looked around at the bustling bookstore, at the happy customers, at the shelves filled with knowledge and stories, I knew that I had done more than just win a bet. I had created something meaningful, something that would last, something that proved, once and for all, that I was more than just a spoiled socialite. I was a businesswoman, a visionary, a survivor, and I was just getting started. The game, as always, was about proving myself, and I, Eleanor Whitmore, reborn and revitalized, was winning. One book, one customer, one victory at a time. Whitmore Books was more than just a success. It was a phenomenon. It defied expectations, shattered conventions, and became a vibrant hub of intellectual and social life in a region that had frankly been starved for both. The villagers, initially hesitant, embraced the novelty of a bookstore that offered not just books, but also coffee, pastries, and a welcoming atmosphere. Farmers, merchants, and laborers mingled with the gentry, all drawn by the allure of stories, of knowledge, of connection. The reading events were particularly popular. Local scholars, poets, and storytellers found a platform for their talents, and the community discovered a newfound appreciation for the arts. The children's corner was a constant source of delight, filled with the sounds of laughter and the rustling of pages. Even the nobility, initially skeptical of my undignified venture, started to come around. They saw the value in having a cultural center, a place to socialize, to learn, to be seen. And the profits were undeniable. I'd not only met Lady Beatrice's challenge, I'd exceeded it, turning Whitmore Manor into a thriving, self-sustaining enterprise in record time. The day of reckoning arrived exactly 1 month after I'd accepted the bet. Lady Beatrice, accompanied by Alexander and a rather smug-looking Lady Margaret, arrived at Whitmore Books to assess the results. The bookstore was bustling, filled with customers browsing the shelves, sipping coffee, and engaging in animated conversations. The air hummed with a vibrant energy, a sense of community that was palpable. Lady Beatrice, her face a mask of carefully controlled surprise, surveyed the scene. She examined the meticulously kept financial records, questioned my staff, and even, rather reluctantly, sampled one of the pastries. Finally, she turned to me, a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect, admiration, perhaps even a touch of defeat. "Well, Lady Hawthorne," she said, her voice crisp and formal, "it seems you have exceeded expectations. You have won our bet." I smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "Thank you, Lady Beatrice," I said. "I'm glad you're pleased." "Pleased?" she scoffed. "I'm astonished and," she added with a grudging nod, "impressed. You have a talent for business, Lady Hawthorne. A talent that should not be wasted." Alexander, who had been observing the exchange with a quiet amusement, stepped forward. "Indeed, Aunt Beatrice," he said, his voice laced with a subtle pride. "My wife is full of surprises." His words, his tone sent a shiver down my spine. It was the first time he'd publicly acknowledged our connection, the first hint of a warmth that went beyond polite formality. Lady Margaret, ever the pragmatist, simply nodded. "It seems you have found your niche, Eleanor," she said, her voice surprisingly approving. "A useful contribution to the family. And," she added, with a pointed look at Alexander, "a welcome distraction from other pursuits." The victory was sweet, but it was also just the beginning. I'd proven myself, yes, but I'd also stirred up a hornet's nest of social and political complications. And then, there was him, Nathaniel Sterling. He arrived at Whitmore Books a few days after my triumph, ostensibly to offer his congratulations. He was Alexander's cousin, a man I'd mistaken for Alexander in my past life, a mistake that had led to so much pain and suffering. He was charming, handsome, with a disarming smile and an easygoing manner. He was also, I knew, ambitious, politically savvy, and not entirely trustworthy. "Lady Hawthorne," he said, bowing theatrically, "or should I say, the book baroness. You've created quite a stir, you know. Everyone's talking about Whitmore Books." "It's just a bookstore, Lord Sterling," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. Oh, it's much more than that, he said, his eyes twinkling. It's a symbol of innovation, of defiance. You've challenged the conventions, Lady Hawthorne, and you've won. There was something in his tone, a subtle undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Admiration? Or something else? I'm simply trying to make a living, Lord Sterling, I said, my voice cool. Of course, he said, smiling. But you're also making a statement, and that, in our world, is a dangerous thing. He paused, then added, with a seemingly casual air, I heard a rather interesting story, Lady Hawthorne. A story about a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. My heart skipped a beat. He knew, or at least he suspected. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Lord Sterling, I said, my voice steady, despite the tremor in my hands. Oh, I think you do, he said, his smile widening. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The story goes that you, Lady Hawthorne, were once infatuated with a certain young nobleman. A nobleman who, unfortunately, bore a striking resemblance to your husband. He let the words hang in the air, a veiled threat, a subtle reminder of my past mistakes. Ancient history, Lord Sterling, I said, my voice dismissive. I'm a married woman now, and I'm devoted to my husband. It was a lie, of course, or at least a partial lie. My feelings for Alexander were complicated. But I wouldn't let Nathaniel see my vulnerability, my uncertainty. He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowed, assessing. Then he shrugged. As you wish, Lady Hawthorne, he said. But remember this. The past has a way of catching up with us, especially in our world. His words were a warning, a challenge, a promise of future conflict. And then there was Isabel Langford, the woman Alexander was supposed to marry, the general. She was a legend, a war hero, a woman who had risen through the ranks of the military through sheer skill, determination, and courage. She was everything I wasn't. Strong, independent, and utterly fearless. She arrived at Hawthorne Manor unannounced, her presence commanding attention, her demeanor hostile. Lady Hawthorne, she said, her voice sharp and clipped, as she confronted me in the hallway. She didn't bow, didn't offer any of the usual courtesies. I believe we have something to discuss. General Langford, I replied, my voice calm and even. To what do I owe the pleasure? You stole him from me, she said, her voice laced with a raw, barely controlled anger. You manipulated him. You used him. You took what was rightfully mine. I did no such thing, General, I said, my voice firm. Your betrothal to the Duke was arranged. It was a political alliance, not a love match. He would have learned to love me, she insisted, her eyes flashing. We were compatible. We understood each other. Perhaps, I said, my voice softening slightly. But you can't force love, General, and you can't force someone to be who you want them to be. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of anger, resentment, and a flicker of something else. Sadness, regret. You may have won him, Lady Hawthorne, she said, her voice low and threatening. But you haven't won the war. This world, it's a dangerous place. And you've made enemies. Powerful enemies. I'm aware of that, General, I replied, but I'm not afraid. I've faced worse. She gave me one last long look, then turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She was a warrior, a fighter, and I knew I hadn't seen the last of her. The pieces were moving, the players aligning themselves, the game escalating. I was surrounded by rivals, by enemies, by potential allies. I had to be careful, strategic, and, above all, ruthless. I had to protect myself, protect Alexander, and protect the future I was so desperately trying to build. The whispers of the past were growing louder, the shadows lengthening, but I, Eleanor Whitmore, reborn and resolute, was ready to face them, head on. And this time, I wouldn't just survive. I would triumph. The whispers started subtly, then grew into a roar. King Edmund Lancaster was interested in me. Edmund Lancaster was everything a king should be and everything a man shouldn't. He was charismatic, undeniably so, with a smile that could charm the birds from the trees and a voice that could soothe the savage beast. He was also known for his appetite, for power, for pleasure, for women. He'd seen me, of course, at various courtly functions, at the Hawthorne events, even at the bookstore, a visit that had sent the gossips into overdrive. But he hadn't paid me any particular attention. Until now. The invitation arrived embossed with the royal seal, a summons to a private audience at the palace. It wasn't a request, it was a command. "This is troubling, Eleanor," Alexander said, his voice grim, as he read the invitation. His hand tightened around mine, a possessive gesture that both comforted and thrilled me. "He's testing us, Alexander," I said, my voice calm but my heart pounding. "He's testing you. He sees me as a weakness, a way to control you." "He won't succeed," Alexander said, his voice firm. "I won't let him." But I knew from my fragmented memories of courtly intrigue that King Edmund was not a man to be trifled with. He was cunning, ruthless, and utterly without scruples. He was used to getting what he wanted, and he clearly wanted me. The audience was a masterclass in manipulation. Edmund was charming, gracious, and utterly disarming. He complimented my beauty, my intelligence, my business acumen. He spoke of his admiration for Alexander, his respect for House Hawthorne, his desire for a closer relationship. "Lady Hawthorne," he said, his voice a low, seductive purr as he offered me a glass of wine, "you are a woman of remarkable qualities, a woman who deserves to be appreciated, to be cherished." "I appreciate your kind words, Your Majesty," I replied, my voice carefully neutral, accepting the wine but not drinking it. I knew better than to trust anything offered by a man like Edmund. "I believe we could be allies, Lady Hawthorne," he continued, his eyes locking with mine. "You have influence, connections, a certain understanding of the world that could be invaluable to me. And I, in turn, could offer you protection, power, a place at my side." The offer was blatant, the threat barely veiled. He wanted me as his mistress, his pawn, his trophy. "I am already married, Your Majesty," I said, my voice firm, "and I am loyal to my husband." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "Loyalty is a flexible concept, Lady Hawthorne," he said, "especially in our world. Circumstances change, alliances shift, and husbands can be removed." The threat was clear, unmistakable, and terrifying. I left the palace shaken, but resolute. I wouldn't be intimidated. I wouldn't be manipulated. I wouldn't be his. I told Alexander everything, recounting the conversation verbatim, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. He listened, his face growing increasingly pale, his eyes hardening with a cold, controlled fury. "He dares," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "He dares to threaten you? To threaten us?" "He's testing you, Alexander," I said, my voice urgent. "He's trying to provoke you, to force you into a mistake. We need to be careful. We need to be strategic." And so began a dangerous game of cat and mouse, a silent war waged between the Hawthorns and the crown. King Edmund continued his pursuit, sending gifts, invitations, even veiled threats disguised as friendly advice. He used his political influence to pressure Alexander, to undermine our business ventures, to isolate us. But we were prepared. Alexander, fueled by a protectiveness I'd never seen before, and guided by my knowledge and strategies. We countered his every move, parried his every thrust, turning his manipulations against him. We used the media, leaking carefully crafted stories that portrayed Edmund as a dangerous, unstable ruler, obsessed with a married woman. We forged alliances with other noble houses, strengthening our position, isolating the king. We even, discreetly, funded his political opponents, fueling the flames of discontent. "You're playing a dangerous game, Eleanor," Alexander said one evening as we were reviewing our strategy. He looked tired, worried, but also undeniably alive. The challenge, the danger, seemed to invigorate him. "We're playing to win, Alexander," I replied, meeting his gaze, "and we will win." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that made my heart ache. "I know we will," he said, Because we're together, and together we're unstoppable. The attack, when it came, was unexpected, brutal, and personal. I'd organized a charity event, a fundraiser for the local orphanage, a way to showcase my newfound independence and my commitment to the community. It was a success, a well attended gathering that brought together people from all walks of life. But as I was returning home, escorted by a small contingent of Hawthorne guards, we were ambushed. It was a coordinated attack, swift and deadly. Men in dark cloaks, armed with swords and crossbows, emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured, their intentions clear. My guards fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, outmatched. I was pulled from my carriage, dragged into the darkness, a rough hand clamped over my mouth, stifling my screams. I knew with a sickening certainty who was behind this. It was either Henry and Vanessa's final desperate act of revenge, or a more sinister move by King Edmund, a way to silence me, to remove me from the equation. But then I heard it. The roar of a horse, the clash of steel, the unmistakable sound of Alexander. He appeared out of nowhere, a whirlwind of fury and righteous anger, his sword flashing in the moonlight. He fought like a man possessed, cutting down the attackers with a skill and a ferocity that I'd never seen before. The world tilted, steadied, and then sharpened into a terrifying clarity. The metallic tang of blood, the ragged breaths of the fallen attackers, the pounding of my own heart, it all faded into the background as Alexander knelt beside me, his hands hovering over my face, his eyes blazing with a raw, untamed emotion I'd never seen before. "Evelyn," he said, his voice hoarse, "are you hurt? Tell me you're all right." I think so," I managed, my voice a shaky whisper. My arm throbbed where the blade had grazed me, but it was nothing compared to the fear that had gripped me moments before. The fear of losing him, not myself. He gently examined the cut, his touch surprisingly tender. His eyes, usually so cold and distant, were now filled with a fierce protectiveness that made my breath catch in my throat. "It's not deep," he said, his voice regaining its usual composure, but the underlying tremor remained. "But we need to get you back to the manor, to a physician." He helped me to my feet, his arms supporting me, his body a shield against the lingering threat. And in that moment, something shifted. The pretense, the carefully constructed facade of our alliance, crumbled. We were no longer just two people playing a game. We were something more. The near-death experience, the sheer terror of almost losing each other, or rather, of him almost losing me from his perspective, had stripped away the layers of doubt and suspicion, revealing the raw, undeniable truth of our feelings. For Alexander, it was a brutal awakening. He'd spent so long guarding his heart, protecting himself from the pain of betrayal, that he'd almost missed the blossoming of something real, something precious. I thought I'd lost you," he confessed later that night as we sat by the fire in his study, my arm bandaged, my body still aching. He hadn't left my side since the attack. "You almost did," I replied, my voice soft. "But you saved me, Alexander. You were incredible." He looked away, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "I should have been there sooner," he said. "I should have anticipated the attack. I should have—" "You can't protect me from everything, Alexander," I said gently. "This world, it's dangerous. We both know that." "But you're my wife," he said, his voice fierce. It's my duty to protect you, and I failed." "You didn't fail, Alexander," I insisted. "You saved me, and I saved you." That admission hung in the air between us, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in our relationship. But our newfound closeness, our unspoken, for now, declaration of love, only intensified the threats from those who envied or resented our bond. Lady Marianne Sinclair, a woman who'd made no secret of her desire for Alexander in my past life, stepped up her campaign of subtle sabotage. She spread rumors, whispered insults, and generally tried to undermine my position within society. "Lady Hawthorne is unconventional, isn't she?" she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness to anyone who would listen. "So, independent. One wonders if she truly understands the responsibilities of a duchess." Then there was General Isabel Langford. Her approach was less subtle, more direct. "You took him from me, Eleanor," she said, confronting me during a military review Alexander and I attended. Another calculated move on his part to showcase our united front. You manipulated him, used your feminine wiles to steal what was rightfully mine. I did no such thing, General, I replied, my voice calm but firm. Your engagement to the Duke was a political arrangement, nothing more. You had no claim on his heart. Her eyes flashed with anger. He would have learned to love me, she insisted. We were suited. We understood each other. Perhaps, I said, my voice softening slightly, but he chose me, General, and that, I believe, is the end of the matter. She stared at me, her face a mask of resentment and a flicker of something else. Respect, perhaps, but also a clear warning. This isn't over, Lady Hawthorne, she said, her voice low and threatening. Not by a long shot. But the greatest threat, the most dangerous challenge, came from King Edmund himself. His pursuit of me had escalated from subtle flirtation to outright obsession. He sent lavish gifts, extravagant invitations, and increasingly blatant demands for my presence at court. He was using his power, his influence, to try to force me into submission, to make me his mistress. And he wasn't above using threats. The Hawthorne family has enjoyed a privileged position in this realm, Duke Alexander, he said during a tense meeting at the palace. It was ostensibly about trade negotiations, but the subtext was clear. But such privileges, they can be revoked, easily. Alexander, his face a mask of controlled fury, met the king's gaze directly. Are you threatening me, Your Majesty? I'm simply stating a fact, Duke, Edmund replied, his voice smooth and oily. Loyalty is rewarded. Disobedience is punished. My loyalty is to my wife, Your Majesty, Alexander said, his voice firm, and I will not tolerate any threats against her, from anyone. It was a declaration of war, a line drawn in the sand. Alexander, the Ice Duke, had chosen his side, and he'd chosen me. He stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. If that is all, Your Majesty, he said. His hand found mine. It was warm and strong. We have matters to attend to. We left the palace, the air thick with tension, the future uncertain. But as we walked hand in hand, I knew that we would face whatever came next, together. The game, as always, had reached a critical juncture. But this time, I wasn't alone. I had Alexander, and he, finally, had me. The hunter had become the protector and the pawn. The pawn was about to become a queen. The pressure, once a subtle undercurrent, now became a relentless tide. Lady Margaret, ever the pragmatist, saw the writing on the wall. The conflict with King Edmund was escalating, and the Hawthorne family needed to solidify its position, and that meant an heir. You need to secure the succession, Alexander, she said, her voice firm during one of our increasingly frequent family meetings. A strong heir will solidify your position, discourage your enemies, and ensure the future of House Hawthorne. She looked at me, her gaze pointed, expectant. The unspoken message was clear. Produce a child, Eleanor. Fulfill your duty. It wasn't an unreasonable request, not in this world. An heir was essential, a symbol of stability, a guarantee of continuity. But for me, it was complicated. I loved Alexander, yes. More deeply, more genuinely than I'd ever thought possible. But the memories of my past life, of the forced marriage, of the loveless, bitter union, still haunted me. The thought of being bound to him not by choice, but by duty, by expectation, filled me with a subtle dread. Mother, Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. I understand your concerns, but these things take time. Time is a luxury we do not have, Alexander, she retorted. The king is growing impatient. Our enemies are circling. We need to show strength. We need to show unity. I saw the conflict in Alexander's eyes. He understood his mother's concerns, the political realities of our situation, but he also, I sensed, respected my hesitation. We will discuss it, Mother, he said finally, in private. The conversation, when it happened, was awkward. We were standing in the library, surrounded by books, by the silent witnesses of generations of Hawthorne history. Eleanor, he began, his voice hesitant. My mother is right. About the need for an heir. It's a matter of political necessity. I know, I said, my voice low. I couldn't meet his gaze. But, he continued, his voice softening, it's more than that. For me, I I want a family with you, Eleanor. A real family, not a political arrangement. I finally looked up, meeting his eyes. I saw the sincerity there, the love, the hope. And I also saw the lingering uncertainty, the ghost of the past that still haunted us both. I want that too, Alexander, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. But, but you're afraid, he finished for me. Afraid of repeating the past, afraid of being trapped again. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. He reached out, taking my hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. I understand, Eleanor, he said. I do, but this is different. We are different. I'm not Henry. And you're not the woman you once were. He was right. We were different. But the past has always had a way of casting a long shadow. And then Nathaniel intervened. He'd been a quiet, almost peripheral figure in our lives ever since my return. He'd observed the unfolding drama, the shifting alliances, the growing bond between Alexander and me. He sought me out one afternoon in the gardens. Lady Hawthorne, he said, his voice hesitant. May I have a word? Of course, Lord Sterling, I replied, my voice carefully neutral. He looked uncomfortable, nervous, as if he were carrying a burden he could no longer bear. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice low. Something about the past, about your first marriage. My heart skipped a beat. I knew instinctively what was coming. He confessed. He told me everything about how I'd mistaken him for Alexander, about how I'd confessed my infatuation, about how he'd failed to correct me. I was young, ambitious, he admitted, his voice filled with shame. I saw an opportunity to advance my own position, to gain favor with your family. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, and he saw that Alexander was starting to care. And then, when you forced the marriage, he continued, I did nothing. I stood by and watched it happen. I knew it was wrong. I knew you were making a mistake, but I didn't stop you. It was a confession, a release of years of pent-up guilt and regret. And it was also, I realized, a revelation. You knew, I whispered, my voice trembling. You knew all along. He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Eleanor, he said. I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have done something. His confession, while painful, was also liberating. It confirmed what I'd always suspected, that my initial attraction to Alexander had been based on a lie, a misunderstanding, a cruel twist of fate. I told Alexander everything. I recounted Nathaniel's confession, my own past mistakes, my foolish infatuation with a man I barely knew. He listened, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Thank you, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, for telling me the truth. I should have told you sooner, I said, my voice filled with regret. Perhaps, he said, but it doesn't matter now. The past is the past. We can't change it. We can only learn from it. He reached out, taking my hand, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. I love you, Eleanor, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Not the woman you were, but the woman you are. And I want a future with you, a real future, a family. And in that moment, all my doubts, all my fears, all my lingering anxieties vanished. I was ready to embrace my new life, my new love, my new destiny. But the universe, as always, had other plans. The final confrontation came, as I'd always known it would, at a grand ball, a lavish affair hosted by the Hawthorne family, a celebration of our supposed unity, our strength, our future. It was a trap, of course, a carefully orchestrated attempt to end things once and for all. Henry and Vanessa, stripped of their power, their wealth, their everything, had one last card to play. They'd allied themselves with King Edmund, feeding his paranoia, fueling his obsession with me, and promising him everything in exchange for their restoration. The ballroom was filled with music, with laughter, with the glittering facade of high society. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. I saw them, of course. Henry, looking haggard and desperate, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and regret. Vanessa, her beauty faded, her expression twisted with malice. They were standing with King Edmund, whispering, plotting, their eyes fixed on Alexander and me. "They're here," I said to Alexander, my voice low, "and they're not alone." He nodded, his hand tightening around mine. "I know," he said. "Be ready." The attack came during the waltz. A carefully choreographed distraction, a staged argument, a moment of chaos. Henry, fueled by desperation and a misplaced sense of grievance, lunged at Alexander, a knife concealed in his hand. "You stole everything from me!" he shouted, his voice raw with fury. "My life, my future, my wife!" But Alexander, prepared, reacted instantly. He deflected the blow, disarmed Henry, and subdued him with a swift, efficient movement. Then Vanessa made her move. She pulled a small vial from her dress, a vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Poison. "If I can't have him," she shrieked, her voice rising above the stunned silence of the crowd, "then no one will." She lunged at Alexander, intending to throw the poison in his face. But I was faster. I intercepted her, knocking the vial from her hand, the liquid splashing harmlessly on the floor. We struggled, a brief, violent clash of wills and desperation. She was stronger than she looked, fueled by madness and a lifetime of resentment. "You were always in my way, Evelyn," she hissed. But I was stronger. I had Alexander. I had training, I had purpose. I disarmed her, forcing her to the ground, my hand pressing against her throat. "It's over, Vanessa," I said, my voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You lost." The guards arrived, dragging Henry and Vanessa away, their screams and protests echoing through the ballroom. King Edmund, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, watched as his carefully laid plans crumbled around him. "You will regret this, Hawthorne," he threatened, his voice low and dangerous. "I doubt it, Your Majesty," Alexander replied, his voice firm. "You have overplayed your hand, and now you will face the consequences." The ball, of course, was ruined, but the message was clear. Alexander and I were a force to be reckoned with. We had faced our enemies, both internal and external, and we had emerged victorious. The past, with all its betrayals and manipulations, was finally behind us. And the future was ours to shape. The aftermath of the ball was a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The threats, both internal and external, had been neutralized. Henry and Vanessa were gone, their power broken, their schemes exposed. King Edmund's influence was waning, his obsession with me a fading ember. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, but all I felt was tired, drained. I'd spent so long fighting, scheming, manipulating, that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to simply be. My year was almost up. The agreement I'd made with Alexander, the promise I'd made to myself, it was time to fulfill it. I packed my belongings, a small collection of clothes and personal items that felt insignificant compared to the weight of my past, the burden of my memories. I found Alexander in the library, his usual haunt. He was standing by the window looking out at the estate, his expression unreadable. "Alexander," I said, my voice hesitant, I'm leaving." He turned, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't look surprised. He'd known, I realized. He'd sensed my intentions. "Leaving?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Where are you going?" "Away," I said vaguely. I fulfilled my promise. I made amends. I set things right." "And that's it?" he asked, his voice low. You're just going to disappear after everything?" "It's what we agreed upon," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "An annulment, a clean break. You're free, Alexander, free to find someone else, someone who what, Eleanor?" he challenged, his voice rising slightly. "Someone who isn't burdened by a past. Someone who hasn't made mistakes. Someone who isn't you." I couldn't meet his gaze. I looked down at my hands, twisting the silver ring, the ring that symbolized our sham marriage, our alliance. "I ruined your life once, Alexander," I whispered. "I won't do it again." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room, his warmth chasing away the chill that had settled over me. He gently lifted my chin, forcing me to look at him. "You didn't ruin my life, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You changed it. You woke me up. You showed me that there was more to life than duty, than obligation, than than cold ambition. He paused, his eyes searching mine. You came here to change fate, Eleanor, he continued, his voice now laced with a raw emotion that made my heart ache. But you changed me. You showed me what it means to truly love, to truly trust, to truly live. Tears welled up in my eyes, tears of regret, of relief, of love. I was so afraid, I confessed, my voice trembling. Afraid of repeating the past, afraid of hurting you again. You could never hurt me, Eleanor, he said, his voice tender. Not anymore, not the way you are now. You're not the same woman who married me a year ago. You're stronger, kinder, more real. He reached out, cupping my face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away my tears. Please stay, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Stay, Eleanor, be my wife, not in name, but in heart. Be my partner, my love, my everything. It was the plea I'd longed to hear, the declaration I'd dreamed of, the absolution I'd craved. And in that moment, all my doubts, all my fears, all my lingering anxieties vanished. I was ready. Ready to embrace my new life, my new love, my new destiny. Yes, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Yes, Alexander. I'll stay. He pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me in a fierce, possessive embrace. I clung to him, burying my face in his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body, the safety of his love. The kiss that followed was a culmination of everything. A release of pent-up emotions, a celebration of newfound freedom, a promise of a future together. It was a kiss that sealed our bond, not as husband and wife in name only, but as partners, as lovers, as soulmates. The days that followed were a blur of happiness, of relief, of getting to know each other truly for the first time. We talked, we laughed, we shared our hopes and dreams, our fears and insecurities. We explored the estate hand in hand, discovering hidden corners, secret gardens, places that held new meaning for us. We made love, not as strangers bound by duty, but as two people deeply, irrevocably in love. It was a passionate, tender, fulfilling union, a celebration of our connection, our commitment, our future. And I realized, with a certainty that warmed me from the inside out, that I had finally found my home. Not in a place, not in a title, not in a destiny, but in a person, in Alexander. We renewed our vows, a private ceremony, just the two of us, in the small chapel on the estate. This time, the words were real, meaningful, filled with a love that was both passionate and profound. I, Alexander, he said, his voice firm and clear, his eyes locked on mine, take you, Eleanor, to be my wife, my partner, my love for all the days of my life. Not because of duty, not because of obligation, but because I choose you, because I love you. And I, Eleanor, I replied, my voice trembling with emotion, take you, Alexander, to be my husband, my partner, my love for all the days of my life. Not because of fate, not because of a second chance, but because I choose you, because I love you. And as we sealed our vows with a kiss, I knew that we had finally, truly rewritten our story. The past was behind us, the future uncertain, but our love was a constant, a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of second chances and the enduring strength of the human heart. I had come to this world seeking redemption, and I had found it not in the way I expected, but in a way that was far more profound, far more meaningful, far more real. I had found it in love, and that, I knew, was a victory worth more than any title, any fortune, any empire.